One is, and this is not a Singapore only, I think, phenomenon, we tend to rate success of society by GDP per capita. And by that measure, Singapore's, the top of the top, or close to the top, depending on whether you want to use nominal or PPP, whatever, right? Why don't we look at instead, why don't governments or why don't policymakers, academics and so on, look at instead income as another sort of very quantitative measure? Wouldn't that be a better way? And I've looked up the statistics, maybe a couple of weeks ago, and I'm quite interested in the topic. And by that measure, certainly Singapore is not among the top. And I think in the last speaker's session, you mentioned actually this very point. So why don't we prioritize that? And equally, as I was saying in the break to Yuyun as well, I think some of the measures of success or measures of even internal measures of, am I a successful person, aren't only economic in nature, right? So I think, how can we encourage and how can we optimize for other measures of success of society? So that's kind of observation number one. Number two is, and again, this is not a Singapore only thing, but I think it's especially pronounced in Singapore. I look around here and that person is not in the audience right now, the person on the screen, or anyone like her, right? At the most basic level, I was coming in here and I was riding my motorcycle, and it's not a $50,000 BMW, it's a basic motorcycle. And the sign downstairs says, no parking for motorcycles, right? So, and a lot of, my neighborhood fruit juice uncle, he rides a motorcycle to his workplace and back home to wherever he stays. So I think we tend to, hide the problem and think of it as us versus them. What can we do for them, rather than what can we do for all of us, right? They and we are all the same people. As Jeanette, you just rightly said, we are all equal, right? I mean, we are all part of the same sort of forum. So why don't we have some of that here as well? And I have read academic studies where people have, academics themselves have actually lived among the poor, both in rich countries and in poor countries, and actually managed to get a better understanding of how, their lives are, or I should say our lives are, and then try to formulate responses to that. So those are just two observations, and I could go on for an hour, but I'll stop.
Yeah, 3 weeks ago, The Economist had a very good piece. This is from The Economist, stuff the economists read, right? Or are supposed to read, on the deficiencies of GDP as a measure of well-being. I encourage all of you to read it. It's an incredibly flawed tool which governments have unthinkingly and robotically used as most direct measure of well-being. It doesn't serve its purpose. It doesn't serve the purpose of measuring well-being. I'll give you an example. In the year that the Exxon Valdez occurred, the oil spill near the state of Alaska, Alaska's GDP went up by 60%. Right? But were Alaskans better off? Did their well-being increase because of the Exxon Valdez? I mean, GDP is just a measure of output, right? It's not even, as you say, the measure of income, much less a measure of well-being. Right, so the first step might indeed be to construct a more direct measure, simply our incomes, right? Then it doesn't go far enough because, income is not in itself a measure of well-being either. A closer measure of well-being is consumption, right? In fact, that doesn't go far enough as well, because consumption is just individual consumption. It doesn't measure socially valued things like trust, like relationships, like social networks, right? So there is no economic or economistic measure of those things, but we can construct various qualitative measures of people's lived experiences, and Gallup has tried to do that in the past decade or so with all these measures of happiness. Right? That kind of happiness studies, happiness measures are in a relatively early stage of study, but already the UK's National Statistical Office measures people's happiness. And they've done it for the last 4 or 5 years. So it is serious stuff. It is stuff that is worth governments investing in and doing. And it's not just some new age hippie thing.
Perhaps Yuyen, you want to just add on? Yeah.
I think one of the second question you asked was how can we encourage more or broader definitions of success? And I think one way to think about that is to ask the question of what are some institutions and mechanisms that we have now that produce very narrow definitions of success. So to look at what's going on now that encourages people to think of success in very narrow ways, right? And we can see that very, very importantly, of course, this is in the school system, right? That there are very narrow, there are very few things that are measured as to what children should do and be able to do. And also importantly, those measurements or that kind of approach happens very early. So there's a very high regard for precocity, essentially, right? There's a high regard for kids who are already prepared for school by the time they enter school, which I think is very odd because I would imagine the school should want to teach kids that don't already know what they want them to know. Yeah, but in the school system, we have that. We have a very high valuation of precocity. Yeah, and it's even within precocity, it's like a very narrow range of things we want. We want them to be able to sit still. We want them to be able to spell words, and we want them to be able to spell precocious, spell butterfly. That's a real one. And there's a lot of streaming very early on, which means, that's very important because that means that there is a very high stakes game. It means that as a parent, even if you don't believe in the things, in what is being rewarded or in what is being taught, you understand that there are high stakes for not playing the game, right? And the consequences for it, again, because it's very streamed and it's very stratified very quickly, kids are sorted into different types very quickly, very early on. The consequences of missing the path also are very high because your school results and what kinds of schools you go to later also shape your employment. And employment and CPF savings are a really important part of how you get access to public housing, to health, to all kinds of other different things, right? So there's a high level of sort of individualized access to public goods. Yeah. So when parents, spend a lot of their disposable income on tuition, on enrichment classes, on extra coaching, I mean, they're acting in rational ways in response to the system, right? So I think it's really important to look at, when we say we have a world-class education system, we need to make sure our schools are teaching what they're requiring from the children. Yeah? And we need to make sure that what they're rewarding in the kids is what they're actually learning in school and not outside, in all these other ways. So why would, again, so coming back to your question, why should the definition of success be so narrow now? I mean, we can look at our systems, and the school system is a big part of it. And that's where I think, that's one of the places I think that a lot of interventions are necessary.